On the coldest night of December, a woman stood on a street corner with nothing but a thin blanket and a child sleeping against her chest.
She wasn't begging for money. She wasn't asking for fame or fortune. She was simply asking strangers to keep her daughter warm and fed.
What happened next wasn't a miracle in the fairy tale sense, it was something far more real, far more powerful, and far more transformative. This is the true story of Sarah, a mother who lost everything, and how one moment of raw honesty from the heart of desperation became the beginning of a life she never thought possible.
Sarah had always been the kind of person who worked hard and asked for nothing from anyone.
She grew up in a small town where her parents taught her that pride and independence were everything. Her mother would often say, "We take care of our own, and we don't burden others." This lesson stayed with Sarah her entire life, like a tattoo on her soul that she couldn't erase even when she wanted to. The first crack in Sarah's carefully built life appeared on a Tuesday morning when she received a call from her employer. The manufacturing company where she had worked for 8 years was closing down its local branch. They offered 2 weeks of severance pay, which felt like nothing when you looked at your calendar and counted the days until rent was due. Sarah had been earning barely enough to keep her head above water as a single mother. The severance would disappear in her landlord's hands before she even had time to think about next month. She was 34 years old, with a daughter named Emma who was 7. Emma was everything to Sarah, the reason she woke up in the morning, the reason she smiled when things were difficult, the reason she kept pushing forward even when the world felt impossibly heavy. Emma's laugh was like medicine for Sarah's tired soul. Emma's small hand in hers made everything seem manageable, even when it wasn't. The job search became Sarah's full-time work. She spent 8 to 10 hours a day applying for positions, attending interviews, calling companies, sending emails. Her fingers became sore from typing. Her voice grew hoarse from talking on the phone. But the jobs she could actually get were far from enough. Fast food restaurants offered minimum wage with unpredictable schedules. Retail stores wanted people who could work nights and weekends. Cleaning services required her to travel across the city, eating up time and money in transportation costs. Nothing added up to enough money to keep them stable. 3 months into unemployment, Sarah fell behind on rent. Her landlord, a man who owned several properties in the area, wasn't sympathetic. He gave her 30 days to pay up or get out. Sarah had no family to turn to. Her parents had passed away years ago, her mother first, and then her father, almost as if he couldn't live without her. She had an aunt in another state, but their relationship had grown distant over the years, and Sarah couldn't bring herself to call and admit that she was drowning. The pride her mother had instilled in her was still there, whispering in her ear, telling her that asking for help was the same as failing. She moved them into a smaller apartment, a one-bedroom in a rougher neighborhood that she could barely afford. Emma had to share a room with her mother. The walls were thin, and you could hear everything from the neighbors' arguments, crying, loud music late into the night. But at least they had a roof. At least Emma had a bed to sleep in. Then, Sarah got sick. It started as a cold, just a cough and a sore throat. She tried to ignore it, but her body wasn't listening to what her mind wanted. The fever came next, and then the chills. She could barely get out of bed. She couldn't go to interviews. She couldn't send out applications. She lost 2 weeks of potential work, and, more importantly, she lost her focus. When you're sick and alone and scared, it's hard to think clearly about anything else. When she finally recovered, things had gotten worse. She'd fallen behind again. The landlord who had given her a chance was now threatening eviction once more. Sarah found herself working 3 part-time jobs, cleaning houses in the morning, working at a convenience store in the afternoons, and babysitting for a few families on select evenings. She would wake up at 5 in the morning and often didn't get to bed until midnight. Emma would sometimes fall asleep waiting for her mother to come home, and Sarah would carry her small body to bed, whispering apologies into her hair. The exhaustion was like drowning in slow motion. Every morning, Sarah woke up and couldn't remember why she was still trying. Every night, she looked at Emma sleeping peacefully and remembered. That was the only thing that kept her going, her daughter's innocent, trusting face in the dark. But even that wasn't enough to keep them afloat forever. Sarah made a mistake one month. She miscalculated how much money she had and spent a little too much on groceries and Emma's school supplies.
When rent came due, she was short. She asked her landlord for an extension. He said no. He told her she had 1 week to leave. Sarah's hands shook as she packed their belongings into bags and suitcases.
Emma watched from the corner of their small apartment, not fully understanding what was happening, only knowing that her mother was scared, and that scared her too.
Sarah moved them into a shelter on the edge of the city.
It was a clean place, and the people who worked there were kind, but it was still a place where families who had fallen through the cracks went to survive. Sarah felt the shame of it like a physical weight on her chest. The pride her mother had taught her felt like a boulder crushing her, and she couldn't lift it. She couldn't call her aunt. She couldn't tell anyone from her past life what had happened. In her mind, she had failed not just at keeping a roof over their heads, but at the fundamental task of being a good mother. The shelter provided meals, and Sarah was grateful for that. But the meals were basic and often not enough to fill the holes of hunger that both she and Emma felt.
Sarah would skip meals so Emma could eat more.
She would tell her daughter that she'd already eaten, even though her stomach was growling. Other mothers at the shelter did the same thing. It was an unspoken code: the children came first, always, no matter what.
Winter arrived early that year.
The weather was brutal, cold in a way that seemed to cut through your skin and chill your bones from the inside out. The shelter filled up quickly, and, eventually, there wasn't enough space for everyone.
Sarah and Emma were told they would have to leave.
The shelter worker who delivered this news looked sad about it, apologetic, but the numbers were the numbers, and there were families who had been there longer who had priority. Sarah found herself back on the streets with a 7-year-old daughter and a backpack of their belongings. She tried to find another shelter, but they were all full. Every door she knocked on had the same answer: come back tomorrow, or try another place, or we're at capacity.
The temperature dropped to freezing at night.
Sarah bought a thin blanket with money she didn't have, using a credit card that was already maxed out. She didn't know how she would ever pay it back, but she knew Emma needed something warm.
That's where they were when December came. Sarah had spent 3 months on the streets by then.
She'd learned where the public restrooms were, where she could get Emma cleaned up, where the churches handed out free meals. She'd learned how to be invisible, how to exist in public spaces without being noticed or harassed. She'd learned that pride is a luxury that homeless people can't afford, so she tried to let it go, but it was still there, like a ghost that haunted her. The night before the night that changed everything, Sarah and Emma slept under a highway overpass, bundled together under that thin blanket.
Emma was getting sick. She had a cough and a fever.
Sarah could feel the heat radiating from her daughter's small body, and she was terrified.
She didn't have money for medicine. She didn't have money for a doctor.
All she had was her body to keep her child warm, her arms to hold her through the night, and her hope that morning would come and somehow things would be okay. But morning came, and Emma was worse. She was lethargic and coughing harder.
Sarah knew this was serious.
She picked her daughter up and began walking toward the hospital, but she didn't have money for the emergency room.
She didn't have insurance.
She'd learned from other homeless people that hospitals would help you regardless of ability to pay, but the thought of sitting in a waiting room, looking like she looked, being seen for what she had become, it was almost more than she could bear. As night fell again, Sarah made a decision that broke something inside her but also set something free. She decided that her daughter was more important than her pride.
Emma's health was more important than her shame.
She took her daughter to the busiest street corner in the downtown area, the one where people walked from their offices and their restaurants and their nice homes. It was the coldest night of the year, with temperatures dropping below freezing. Sarah pulled Emma close and held up a piece of cardboard that she had written on with a pen she'd found in a trash can. It read, "Please, let me stay warm, just feed my child." She stood there as the sun set and darkness fell, watching people pass. Some looked at her and looked away.
Some didn't look at all.
Some threw coins into a cup she'd placed on the ground.
But Sarah wasn't asking for money.
She was asking for something bigger. She was asking for people to care, to see her daughter, to remember that they were human beings who had somehow fallen into a crack in the system that had no bottom. Then, as the night grew colder and Emma shivered against her chest, a woman stopped.
She wasn't dressed like someone wealthy.
She looked like she had her own struggles. She read the sign and looked at Emma, really looked at her.
And then, she asked Sarah a simple question: "What do you need?"
Not in a pity-filled voice, but in a voice that treated Sarah like a person, like someone worth helping, like someone whose answer mattered. In that moment, standing on a frozen street corner with her fevered daughter in her arms, Sarah told the truth.
She told the woman about Emma's illness, about the hospital, about the lack of insurance.
She told her about the jobs and the evictions and the shelter. She told her about 3 months on the streets and about the pride that had kept her from asking for help until it was almost too late. She told her about being a mother who was failing her child, and how that was the worst kind of failure. The woman listened without interrupting. And, when Sarah finished, the woman did something that Sarah didn't expect. She cried. Then, she took out her phone and called someone. Part 2. The moment everything shifted. The woman's name was Margaret, and she was a nurse at the hospital 3 blocks away. She had just finished a long shift and was walking home, thinking about her own problems, a difficult patient she couldn't help, a marriage that was struggling, a sense that maybe she wasn't making enough of a difference in the world. When she read Sarah's sign and heard her story, something inside Margaret woke up. She told Sarah to wait right there, and then she called a colleague at the hospital, a social worker named David who specialized in cases exactly like Sarah's.
20 minutes later, David arrived in his car.
He was a kind man in his 50s with gray hair and a way of speaking that made you feel like he genuinely cared about your answer when he asked how you were doing. He drove Sarah and Emma directly to the emergency room. Margaret met them there, having called in a favor with the triage nurse to get Emma seen quickly despite the waiting room being full. Within an hour, Emma had been examined and was being treated for pneumonia and a severe upper respiratory infection. She was admitted to the hospital for observation and treatment. Sarah sat in a chair next to Emma's hospital bed, watching her daughter sleep while 4 fluids dripped into her small arm. The hospital staff had provided her with a pillow and a blanket, and she realized as she sat there that she hadn't slept properly in months. She hadn't felt safe enough to fully relax. But now, in this hospital room, she let herself cry. All of the fear and stress and desperation that she'd been holding inside for 3 months came pouring out. A nurse found her crying and didn't judge her. She just brought her water and tissues and sat with her for a few minutes. David, the social worker, came to see her the next morning. He had a thick file in his hands, and he explained that he'd spent most of the night working on Sarah's case. He'd been doing this job for 25 years, and he told Sarah that he saw a lot of people who gave up when things got hard. But he'd also learned that when someone was willing to ask for help, truly willing to put their pride aside and be honest about their needs, then real change was possible. He explained the programs that were available to her. There was emergency housing assistance for families with children. There was a program that helped people who had experienced job loss to get retrained for new careers. There was food assistance, medical assistance, and childcare assistance. David told Sarah that none of these things were charity or handouts, even though that's how Sarah's mother had taught her to think of them. They were systems that society had built to help people get back on their feet. Sarah had been working and paying taxes for 14 years before everything fell apart. In a way, these programs were hers to use if she needed them. The thought that she had already paid for these systems somehow made it easier for Sarah to accept help. It reframed the entire thing in her mind. She wasn't a failure asking for charity. She was a person using the resources that her community had built for people in exactly her situation. It was subtle, but that shift in perspective changed something fundamental about how she felt about herself. David helped her fill out the applications over the next few days. Margaret came by when she wasn't working and brought Emma books to read and drawing supplies to keep her occupied as she recovered. Other staff members at the hospital started noticing Sarah and Emma's story, and they would stop by to say hello, to bring extra snacks, to offer support and kindness. One nurse taught Emma how to do a puzzle. A kitchen worker made sure that Sarah got extra servings of food. a maintenance man fixed the television in their room so Emma could watch cartoons. Sarah began to understand something that her mother had never taught her, that accepting help wasn't weakness. It was actually bravery. It took more courage to admit you needed help than it did to struggle alone and suffer in silence. And the people who helped her weren't doing it because they pitied her. They were doing it because they saw themselves in her story. They understood that any of them, with a few bad breaks, could end up in a similar situation. After 5 days, Emma was discharged from the hospital. The pneumonia had cleared, and she was eating and playing again. The fever was gone, and she had that light back in her eyes. Sarah's heart felt like it was going to burst from gratitude and relief. But David had more news for her. While Sarah and Emma were in the hospital, he had been working behind the scenes. He had found them a place to stay, a small shared house run by a non-profit organization that provided temporary housing for families transitioning out of homelessness. The house had several bedrooms, and Sarah and Emma would share one. They could stay for up to 2 years, rent-free, while Sarah got on her feet. The only requirement was that Sarah participate in the job training program that the non-profit offered. Sarah moved them into the house just before Christmas. The house was warm and clean. Emma had her own bed. Sarah had a place to shower and sleep without fear of being harassed or arrested for loitering. And, most importantly, they both knew where they were going to be sleeping when the sun went down. The relief of that knowledge was almost as powerful as any medicine. The job training program started in January. Sarah joined a cohort of 15 other people who were either homeless or transitioning out of homelessness. The program offered training in several different fields: healthcare, technology, skilled trades, and business. Sarah chose healthcare, partly because she'd seen how the nurses and doctors at the hospital had treated her with kindness and respect, and partly because she knew that helping people was something she was good at. She'd been helping Emma and herself survive on the streets, and, in many ways, that took all the skills that nurses needed: patience, quick thinking, compassion, and the ability to stay calm in a crisis. The training was intensive. It required Sarah to study every day, to take tests, to practice skills. But, for the first time in a long time, she was investing in her future instead of just surviving the present moment. Emma started 2nd grade at a new school. The school had a free lunch program, and Emma made friends. She was happy again in a way that broke Sarah's heart when she thought about how much her daughter had lost the safety, the normalcy, the childhood that should have been carefree. But Emma was resilient in the way that children often are. She adapted. She didn't talk much about the months on the streets, but Sarah could tell that Emma was processing what had happened, working through it in her own way. One night, Emma drew a picture in school that was meant to be about her family. She drew Sarah and herself holding hands. Above them, she drew the hospital and Margaret and David. She drew the shelter workers and the church volunteers. She drew the woman who had given them blankets when they were sleeping outside. "This is our family," Emma explained to her teacher. "Everyone who helped us." Sarah saw the drawing and understood that her daughter had learned something that maybe was more important than anything else: that family isn't just the people you're born to. It's the people who choose to help you, who choose to see you, who choose to invest in your humanity even when they don't have to. After 6 months in the training program, Sarah was ready to test for her certification as a nursing assistant. The test was hard, but Sarah had never been so focused in her life. She had something to work toward. She had hope. That combination was powerful enough to push her through the difficult moments. When she got her results, she found out that she'd passed. Not just passed, she'd scored in the top 5% of all test takers. The organization that ran the training program celebrated with her. They hired her to work in their healthcare clinic, which served low-income patients. The salary was modest, but it was consistent, and it was enough. Sarah could afford to pay her share of the rent for the transitional house. She could buy Emma new shoes when she outgrew hers. She could put money away in a savings account, watching it grow from one week to the next. Margaret, the nurse who had stopped on the street corner that cold December night, became Sarah's mentor. She would meet with Sarah after her shifts and teach her more about healthcare, about how to navigate the medical system, about how to be a nurse who actually cared about her patients the way Sarah cared about helping people. Margaret had seen something in Sarah that night on the street, a person with strength and integrity, with the capacity to help others, with the kind of heart that the healthcare field needed more of.
8 months into her job, Sarah's supervisor called her into the office. Sarah's heart jumped. Her old instinct was to assume that something was wrong.
But her supervisor was smiling. She told Sarah that her performance reviews had been exceptional, that she had a natural gift for patient care, that she was compassionate and reliable and professional. The supervisor offered Sarah a raise and asked if she'd be interested in pursuing her licensed practical nurse certification, which the clinic would help pay for. It was the kind of opportunity that people like Sarah, people without a safety net, didn't usually get. It was the kind of opportunity that could change everything. Sarah said yes. Part 3, the transformation and what comes after. By the time Sarah had been at the non-profit clinic for a year, everything about her life had changed in ways both big and small. The big changes were obvious. She had a job, a home, a future that she was building with her own 2 hands. But the small changes were just as important. She smiled more. She looked people in the eye when she talked to them. She didn't flinch at loud noises or the approach of authority figures anymore. Her body remembered that it was safe, and her mind was beginning to believe it too. Emma was thriving in 3rd grade. Her teacher reported that she was a bright, kind, creative student. She had made a best friend named Maya, and they spent their afternoons playing in the backyard of the transitional house, making up games and drawing pictures. Emma didn't ask Sarah about the months on the streets anymore. She didn't seem to need to. It was becoming a part of her history rather than her present reality, and that felt right. Sarah started working on her LPN certification while continuing her job at the clinic. She studied in the evenings after Emma was asleep, and sometimes Emma would wake up and find her mother at the kitchen table with textbooks and notes spread out everywhere. "Are you learning to be a real nurse?" Emma would ask. "Yes, baby," Sarah would say. "I'm learning to be a real nurse." And Emma would nod seriously, as if that made perfect sense, as if of course her mother was going to be a nurse, because her mother was capable of anything. It took Sarah 11 months to complete her certification and pass her licensing exam. When she got the news that she'd passed, she called Margaret, and Margaret came over to celebrate. They sat in the small living room of the transitional house with Emma, and Margaret brought champagne for the adults and fancy juice for Emma, and they talked about how far Sarah had come from the night she stood on a frozen street corner with a piece of cardboard in her hand. "Do you remember what you asked for?" Margaret asked. Sarah smiled. "I asked to stay warm and feed my child." "And now?" Margaret asked. "Now I can do both," Sarah said. "And I can do it for myself, not just by the grace of strangers." Margaret reached over and squeezed Sarah's hand. "You were always going to get here," she said. "It was in you the whole time. I just happened to walk past at the right moment." Sarah shook her head. "No," she said. "That's not how it works. I was lost. I was going down a path that would have ended in tragedy. You stopped on that street corner and you chose to help me when you could have just walked past. You, and David, and this organization, and everyone who believed in me when I didn't believe in myself, you all made this possible." A week after getting her LPN license, Sarah was offered a position at the hospital where she'd taken Emma when she was sick. It wasn't a coincidence. David had been in touch with the hospital, had recommended Sarah for a position, had vouched for her character and her abilities. The hospital was looking for experienced staff who understood the struggles of vulnerable populations. Someone like Sarah, who had lived through homelessness, who understood the fear and shame and complexity of poverty, that person could offer something that no amount of training alone could provide. Sarah accepted the position and gave notice at the clinic. Her colleagues threw a small goodbye party for her, which made her cry happy tears. She'd developed real friendships with the people she worked with, and they'd become part of her community. But everyone understood that this was the next step, that this was Sarah taking the ladder that had been built for her and climbing higher.
On Sarah's first day at the hospital as an LPN, she put on her white uniform and her name tag that said Sarah Kim, licensed practical nurse. She looked at herself in the mirror for a long moment, barely recognizing the woman looking back at her. This woman wasn't exhausted and afraid. This woman looked capable. This woman looked like someone who had survived something and came out the other side. Her first shift, she was assigned to work in the emergency room. She was nervous, excited, determined to do a good job. And then, near the end of her shift, a woman came in with a young child who had a high fever. Sarah recognized the fear in the mother's face. She'd worn that same expression not so long ago. She sat with the mother while the child was being examined, and she talked to her the way she wished someone had talked to her when Emma was sick and she was terrified. "Everything is going to be okay," Sarah told the mother. "We're going to take care of your daughter. You're going to take care of your daughter. That's what matters." The mother looked at Sarah with gratitude, and Sarah wondered if the mother could see her story in Sarah's face. Could she tell that Sarah had stood where she was standing? Could she feel the authenticity of Sarah's reassurance? 2 years after that cold December night on the street corner, Sarah moved out of the transitional house. She'd saved enough money for a deposit and first month's rent on a small one-bedroom apartment for her and Emma. It wasn't a fancy place, but it was hers. She had a lease with her name on it. She was renting from a landlord as an employed person with good references and good credit history, which she'd slowly been building back up. Walking into that apartment with the key in her hand, Sarah felt like she was finally home. Emma decorated their new place with drawings and stickers. She had her own room with her own bed. Sarah had a small corner of the living room that was her own space. They could make noise at normal times and whisper when they wanted to without worrying about disturbing a whole house of other people. They had privacy and space and safety. That same year, Sarah received a promotion at the hospital. She was asked to serve as a mentor for nursing assistants who were coming through a training program that the hospital had started partnering with, the same kind of program that had saved her life. The hospital realized that patients responded better to care from people who understood their situations, and they wanted to hire more people from vulnerable populations and provide them with pathways to professional nursing. Sarah became one of the first people hired for this new mentorship role. Her job was to work with students who were often coming from similar backgrounds to her own: poverty, homelessness, addiction, trauma. She taught them not just the skills they needed to be good nursing assistants, but also how to navigate the healthcare system, how to manage poverty while trying to improve yourself, how to hold on to hope when everything seems hopeless. She shared her story with them, not to make them feel sorry for her, but to show them that it was possible to survive and, eventually, to thrive. 3 years after the night on the street corner, Sarah received an email from a woman named Jessica. Jessica had been in Sarah's mentorship cohort 2 years earlier. She wrote to tell Sarah that she'd just been accepted into a nursing program. She'd completed her certification as a nursing assistant, working her way up from the streets where she'd been living. She was going to become a nurse, and she wanted Sarah to know that Sarah's mentorship had made that possible. She wanted to say thank you. Sarah read that email multiple times, and each time, she cried. This was the thing that nobody had told her when she was standing on that street corner, that when you let yourself be helped, when you accept grace, when you work hard to rebuild your life, you create the possibility of helping others in ways that multiply the impact. Jessica was going to help people. Those people were going to help others. The impact of the moment that Margaret stopped on the street corner was going to ripple outward in ways that nobody could predict. 5 years after that transformative night, Sarah was invited to speak at a conference on homelessness and healthcare. She told her story in front of hundreds of people: healthcare workers, nonprofit leaders, government officials, academics. She talked about what it was like to be invisible, to be ashamed, to be certain that you were failing at the most fundamental level. And then, she talked about what it felt like to have someone see you, to have systems in place to help you, to have people who believed in you when you couldn't believe in yourself. I could have died on those streets, Sarah told the audience. My daughter could have become seriously ill or injured. We could have been hit by a car, could have been attacked, could have just given up. Instead, a woman named Margaret stopped and asked what I needed. That moment changed everything. But it wasn't just Margaret. It was David, the social worker. It was the nonprofit that provided housing. It was the training program. It was the hospital that hired me and believed in my potential. It was Margaret again, my mentor. It was every person who chose to help instead of walk past. And, now, I get to be that person for others. After her speech, people approached her. Some were social workers who wanted to partner with Sarah on new initiatives to help homeless populations. Others were nurses who wanted to learn from her experiences. Some were just people whose lives had been touched by the story, who'd been reminded of their own capacity to make a difference. That year, Sarah bought a house. It was small and needed work, but it was hers. She and Emma moved in on a Saturday in September, and they spent the day unpacking boxes and arranging furniture. Emma planted a flower garden in the backyard. Sarah planted a tree in the front yard, a young oak that she planned to watch grow as she and Emma grew older. She bought the house on the same street where Margaret lived. They'd become close friends over the years, and Margaret was there to help with the moving boxes and to celebrate with them that evening, sitting in the backyard as the sun set, talking about how far they'd come from that December night 5 years earlier. "I think about that moment all the time," Margaret told Sarah. "How I almost walked past you. How tired I was that night, how I almost went straight home. But something made me stop." "I'm glad you stopped," Sarah said. "I'm glad I stopped too," Margaret said. "Because you changed my life as much as I changed yours. You reminded me why I became a nurse in the first place. You reminded me that this work matters, that being kind to people matters, that believing in people matters." Emma came out to join them, bringing them lemonade that she'd made herself. She was 10 years old now, confident and kind and thoughtful in ways that Sarah believed came from her mother's example of choosing to help and choosing to believe in people. Emma talked about school, about her dream of becoming a teacher, about the volunteer work she was starting to do at the animal shelter. She was building a life with purpose and meaning, and Sarah realized that this moment with her daughter growing up in safety and love and opportunity, this was the real victory. Not the job or the house or the money in the bank. It was Emma, thriving, becoming herself, having a childhood that was full of joy and possibility. Years later, when Emma was in college studying education, she would write a paper about her childhood for one of her classes. She wrote about the months on the streets not as a tragedy, but as a turning point in her relationship with her mother, and a formative experience that had shaped her understanding of compassion and community. "My mother taught me," Emma wrote, "that family is not just the people we're born to, but the people who choose to see us and help us and believe in us. And when we receive that gift, we have an obligation to pass it forward." Sarah kept a copy of that paper on her nightstand. She read it sometimes when she was having a difficult day, when she was overwhelmed by a patient at the hospital, when she was exhausted from her work mentoring the next generation of nurses. She would read Emma's words and remember that night on the street corner, that moment when she'd finally been desperate enough to ask for help. And she would understand again that the worst moment of her life had somehow also been the beginning of her best life. She had asked to stay warm and feed her child. But what she'd received was so much more. She'd received the chance to rebuild herself. She'd received proof that she was capable of more than she'd ever imagined. She'd received a community that believed in her, and the opportunity to become the kind of person who could pass that belief forward to others. The last time Sarah spoke about her experiences, she was standing at the groundbreaking for a new center dedicated to helping homeless families transition back into stable housing and employment. The building was going to be named after Margaret, who had retired from nursing and dedicated herself full-time to nonprofit work in the homelessness sector. But Margaret insisted that it should be called the Sarah and Margaret Community Center, that Sarah's story was as important to the center's mission as Margaret's work. "Every person who comes through these doors deserves to know that change is possible," Sarah said at that groundbreaking ceremony. "That no matter how far you've fallen, no matter how impossible things seem, there is always a possibility for redemption and rebuilding. My daughter and I lived on the streets. We didn't know how we would survive the next week. But because people chose to help, because systems were in place to support us, because we were willing to be vulnerable and ask for what we needed, everything changed. This center exists so that other people can experience that same transformation. So that other mothers don't have to stand on street corners begging to keep their children warm. So that other children don't have to grow up afraid. So that we, as a community, remember that we are responsible for each other. Sarah looked out at the crowd and saw Margaret smiling at her. She saw David, the social worker, who was now running a network of transitional housing programs across the state. She saw Jessica, who was now a registered nurse working in the same hospital, mentoring nursing assistants of her own. She saw families who had been helped by the programs that Sarah had helped develop and refine. She saw the impact of that one moment of human connection, multiplied across years and lives and communities. And she understood, finally, what her mother had been wrong about. Pride isn't about never needing help. Pride is about having the courage to ask for help when you need it, and, then, the determination to rebuild your life and, eventually, to help others. That kind of earned pride, hard-won pride, is worth something. That kind of pride changes the world. On quiet nights, Sarah would sometimes sit on her front porch and look at the oak tree she'd planted all those years ago. It had grown tall and strong, its roots deep, its branches reaching toward the sky. She would think about the metaphor of that tree, how Sarah had also grown tall and strong, how her roots had gone deep into a community that had nurtured her, how her branches had reached out to help others. And she would be grateful, profoundly grateful, for the night that everything changed, for the woman who had stopped, for the community that had caught her when she was falling. She had asked to stay warm and feed her child. Instead, she had been given the gift of a lifetime, the chance to become more than she thought possible, and the privilege of helping others do the same.